welcome to Book World The Great Escape. Happy New Year. We're now in 2023, starting our third season. This is the first episode. Super excited. Oh, I forgot to put our banner flashing across. I'll do that while you're talking. Mike, why don't you catch us up on your holidays and let us know how you're doing, how you did.
Well, we had a great Christmas with my family, my grandson, daughter, son-in-law, and son. That we were all able to have Christmas. Which the previous year we caught COVID 3 days before Christmas, and so we did not have our usual family Christmas. So it'd been 2 years since we'd done that. So it was awesome, and except for the once in a generation cold snap. Temperatures got down to I think 8 or 9 degrees here.
At this point, it's
Uh,
like once in a week because, yeah, we were 70s yesterday and we're freezing today.
yeah, yeah. Well, it's funny. I mean, 4 days later, the temperatures are back up to the 60s, and the last several days they've been in the 70s here. So it's if you know what Texas is, if you don't like the weather, that's okay. Just wait; it'll change pretty quick. But
Hey, as
and
long as we didn't lose electricity, I'm good because the whole snowmageddon, I'm over.
yeah, that is indelibly burned in my mind. That was one of in my entire life, I don't think I've ever lived through anything like that, and I hope I don't have to again. So, especially y'all, because our electricity never went out, but I know that y'all's did. So that was
Yeah,
not
our,
good.
our my thing was that was the end of the whole 2020 year of Jumanji. So for me, that was like the finale. So I really hope we don't have to deal with that anymore because that was not right.
Yeah. Well, I do have a Comic Con coming up. The Northwest Arkansas Comic Con will be, Melanie and I will be at that January 14th and 15th, Saturday and Sunday. That's in Rogers, Arkansas. And it was in March last year. It's quite a bit earlier this year. Uh, so usually a pretty good con, get to meet a lot of good people and
Mhm.
promote books and things like that. So we're looking forward to that. And how about you, CJ? How was your time off?
Actually, it was really good. Met with the family the day before Christmas Eve, so the 23rd. That was our big, huge family. And then, so the rest of it was just kind of like a laid back, chill Christmas, which is always nice. I enjoy that. And then for New Year's Eve, we work with a lot of the Comic Cons. So we helped run Waifu Fest in Houston. That was fun. Kind of bringing in the new year in an anime Comic Con. You know, that's to me bringing it in with the Comic Con family was fun because a lot of them are vendors that I've seen at other Comic Cons, so that was pretty cool. A couple of the voice actors, John Grimian, Chuck Huber, we've had at multiple Comic Cons, and I got to meet a new one, Tiffany Grant. She was very sweet, and so it was really fun. It was kind of relaxing and just kind of chill, and I'm all for that. But tomorrow night, this is cool news. Hearing it here, tomorrow night, Texas Sisters Press is new to us author Christopher Hooten is doing his book launch, which you are also a part of. So
Mhm.
it's me, Mike, Chris, and multiple other authors. Everybody's bringing special prizes. You can find it at Texas Sisters Press's Facebook page. You can find it on my LinkedIn or you can find it on my YouTube. And we do lots of giveaways, and it's tomorrow night at 6 p.m. Central Time. So don't miss it. It's the first one of the year. It's a great way to start a new year winning a prize. I mean, you can't go wrong. So just kind of come, chill with us, get to know other authors, get to know Christopher, and see what he's like. And yeah, that's the fun part of it. So next week on Book World, we have Lana Lynn coming to talk about Christian fiction. And then Mombirella and I have started a new podcast as well. It will also be on Wednesdays, but it's Wednesdays at 11 Central Time. It's just kind of some good, clean fun, seeing, what trouble we can get into in different events like Comic Cons, Texas Ren Fest, that sort of stuff. So it's just kind of a fun, family friendly, totally family friendly thing. Our slogan for that, our tagline is we solemnly swear we are up to no good. So that started. So we're pretty excited about that. Which that brings us around to today's topic, because we solemnly swear we are up to no good has to do with Marauder's map from Harry Potter. And today we're talking about magical realism. Go for it, Mike.
So the I guess the to start off with magical realism, if I was watching the podcast, if I was a aspiring author, or even if I was experienced author, sometimes there's a confusion about genres and what they mean. Well, magical realism is a subgenre, and it crosses many different genres. Obviously, fiction, fantasy, science fiction, action adventure. And as we go through what is magical realism today, we're going to give some examples of books, popular movies, popular shows, and streaming episodes of shows that all are examples, great examples of magical realism. So, what do you do when you want to know what is something, be it magical realism, be it anything? Well, in today's 21st century society, you Google it.
Hmm.
So, okay. So I did a little surfing because I know what my idea of magical realism, what my understanding of it is. So I took four examples that I Googled that I thought were fairly good, fairly concise explanations of magical realism. And one of those is this: magical realism is a genre of literature that depicts the real world as having an undercurrent of magic or fantasy.
Hmm.
Magical realism is a part of the realism genre of fiction. Within a work of magical realism, and this is important, the world is still grounded in the real world. That's important, okay? But fantastical elements are considered normal in this world. Another definition, another explanation, and I really like this one. Magical realism is a combination of realistic fiction
Hmm.
with magical moments weaved in it. Realistic fiction with magical moments that have been weaved into it.
Right.
And here's a word I did not know existed. It was a new word to me, CJ, uh, and that is hybridity. Have you ever heard of the word hybridity before? I
No, it's
have
not.
not. No, hybridity, and that's spelled Hybridity. Hybridity. So magical realism is an example of hybridity. So
So
what?
kind of like a hybrid of magic and real life.
Right. A more simplistic description of what hybridity means is mixture, a mixture,
Hmm.
as in with hybrid, a mixture. So magical realism is a hybridity or mixture. A mixture of what? It's a mixture of the fantastic with the mundane. It
Hmm.
is the ordinary with the extraordinary.
Hmm.
It is dream life with waking life. It's reality with unreality. So as you can see, it's a mix of these metaphors, hybridity. I really liked um, the fantastic with the mundane. It's a mixture of the fantastic with the mundane.
Which
Um,
brings to mind a couple different examples, kind of like the Fantastic Beasts, which goes
right.
along with Harry Potter series, but fantastical. And then another one is we talked about Mortal Instruments, where they actually call normal people mundane.
I love that word mundane, but hybridity is probably my favorite one for the day.
That's a new
Uh,
one. That's there you go. Starting the new year with new terms. It's great.
that's right. You learn something new. Uh, and here's one last explanation or definition of magical realism. Magical realism is a literary style that weaves threads of fantasy with or threads of fantasy into a depiction of everyday life. Let me repeat that. Magical realism is a literary style that weaves threads of fantasy into a depiction of everyday life. Its heroes are not fairies, they're not sorcerers, they're ordinary people. I
Hmm.
like that. Their heroes aren't fairies or sorceries, they're ordinary people. People whose lives happen to butt up against the extraordinary.
Hmm.
So so magical realism, it would be the the introduction, if you want to call it that, of a magical element or elements into what would pass by as normal everyday life in a normal everyday world.
Hmm.
And I think this is important, CJ, for a lot of authors to particularly those like like us that
Mhm.
do a lot of fantasy. We write a lot of fantasy
Mhm. And
because
so
I don't.
yeah.
So I've heard all my life, back when I was before I'd ever published a book, when I was just a reader, and I would talk with people, that were also readers, and we were discussing books and things like that. When it came to fantasy, uh, I could almost, I mean, I can still see in my mind because the reactions were all the same. Well, no, I don't read that because it's too fantastic. It's not real.
Mhm.
Okay. Now, if you kind of read between the lines there, and I'm a little older now, and I kind of understand better, kind of what these people were saying. And of course, I've had further discussions, and it comes down to this: people do not understand fantasy in the terms of uh, of the way of many fantasy authors write,
Mhm.
particularly those that have a strong undercurrent of magical realism in their books and in their writing. You see, here's a whole class of readers that, as fantasy writers, we can appeal to that have never read fantasy because it's too fantastic, it's unreal. But if you look at what magical realism is, it is real. It's the real world, okay?
Mhm.
And a work of fiction, be it historical fiction, be it cozy mysteries, it's still fiction. It's not real either,
So is
okay?
it kind of like my time travel book,
Right,
Chain Reaction, as well as the Sands of Time trilogy? Because
right.
that actually has, like, the teens who are real life teens are helping those with the gifted, and so it's kind of that blend.
It if you The way I look at it, the appeal to readers who have never read fantasy before with magical realism, the appeal
Mhm.
to it to us as authors to explore that in order, because it's like a whole group of readers that uh, that are just waiting to be tantalized, if you want to call it that, by good stories and good books that use magical realism,
Mhm.
because they can relate to the so-called realistic aspects of the world. We've talked about the definitions of magical realism: ordinary people in
Mhm.
extraordinary circumstances, uh, real world with a magical element introduced to it. And
Mhm.
so the depiction of the way things work, okay, is no different in a book that uses magical realism than it would be in any other genre: historical fiction, gothic romance, action adventure. It's the same. Uh,
So
you're
if I'm following see if I'm following with you correctly. So, like, my time travel one is still sci-fi, but there's magical realism. Same with the Sands of Time trilogy. There's genetic engineering and it's sci-fi heavy, but because it appears in the real world, then that adds an element of magical realism, correct? Am I following that
right.
correctly?
And don't forget your characters. Are your
Mhm.
characters the kind of people that your readers could readily identify with, regardless of the whether it's science fiction, fantasy, or whatever? Uh,
Kinda like your Treasure Hunt Club, is that the one
the
that does that?
treasure hunt, right? And so, and we're going to talk about that a little, just a little bit more in just a minute. But again, I think that as fantasy writers, we miss out if we write off a whole section of the population or
Mhm,
potential readers because they, quote, don't like fantasy, unquote. Well, they may not like fantasy, but they do like a good story.
mhm.
Okay. And if
It's
you can tie that story to
yeah,
every
it's
day,
that they can relate to.
right, right.
Mhm,
Okay. So what I also did, I reached out, and I think all of these authors that we're fixing to use, I got to get their opinions on what they thought magical realism is. So we've Googled magical realism, kind of given you the down and dirty of what it's defined as. But
mhm,
what do other indie authors, what do they think of magical realism? What do they think it is? Okay, so C.I. Chevron, who is the
mhm,
author of Metal, Bone, Cogs, and Fur. We've had her here on Book World as well.
She's
Here's
a
what
steampunk
she's
writer.
what's and she's a steampunk, and she actually has a third book in her steampunk series. Uh, but
But
I
she
asked
takes, if I remember correctly, she takes like, and she steampunk versions a lot of fairy tales.
her fractured fairy tales in a steampunk style. Yep.
Right.
Uh, so I asked CI Chevron, okay, what is magical realism to you? What does that mean? So
Mhm.
here's what she said. She said, I embed magical realism into my writing a lot. It's where the world is pretty normal as we know it, no matter the time period you're in, but there is an extra magical layer to everyday life
Mhm.
where things that shouldn't work do. There could be a reason, like a meteor passing by, which gives everybody extraordinary powers, or it could just be clockwork automatons that work.
Kind of
So,
like that show Heroes, where the
mhm,
eclipse triggered it. Is that kind of
right,
what she's
right,
talking
right. So in her, you know, as you pointed out, CJ, she writes steampunk and
about? Mhm.
fractured fairy tales, and you have machines, right?
Mhm.
And but that's the kind of these machines are part of that magical reality element. Danielle McDonough, who we've also had on Book World, who is the author of the Legacy
Hers is
series,
dystopian fiction.
dystopian fiction,
Hers is kind of almost along the realms of Hunger Games
right?
sort of
Uh,
idea. Mhm.
Divergent, yeah.
Divergent meets Hunger Games. Mhm.
And I liked her definition as well. She said, I think of magical realism as making the magic consistent and balanced enough to be valid.
Mhm.
So, so I take that to mean that if you are reading a book that is embedded with magical realism, the magic has to make sense. It has
Mhm.
to be able to work within the real world in a way that is consistent, and again, it makes sense to the reader. It does. Uh, it's not unpredictable.
Mhm.
And the last author we reached out to was Mike Wigington, who's the author of the Earth Mother series, and we've also had him
His
on.
is apocalyptic fiction, correct?
His is more traditional fantasy, sword and sorcery.
Okay,
Uh,
that's
yeah, and anyway, Mike has been on Book World as well.
mhm.
We've interviewed Mike, and Mike says his understanding or his belief in what magical realism is when magic exists in a world that makes sense in that world.
Mhm.
And it's used in a way that is consistent, which kind of sounds like what Danielle was saying as well, which is consistent with the rules of that world.
Mhm.
It should not be used as a Deus ex machina where it gets the hero or villain out of trouble in an unexplained way or in a way that hasn't been shown in the world already. And in other words, again, it's a magical element that is consistent with the way things work.
Mhm.
It
There's
and
that
you,
rule of law that's the
right,
basic foundation of whatever this world is that you've created, but it's consistent within, like, planet Earth.
right. It's kind
So,
of a,
like, what we were talking about earlier with, like, Marvel and DC.
right.
They are on this world, but there's that element of, okay, where they come from. A lot of them came from a different planet. Thor, you've got, gosh, other ones from different planets. Even Captain Marvel, how she got her powers was consistent and feasible. But of course, Superman's from another planet, Krypton. So yeah, there's ways to do it. Just it has to fit within the rules of law.
So if you are a reader who has not really read fantasy much anymore, it's
Mhm,
huge to be consistent in the way
mhm,
that things work. And I think that's what Mike and I think also that's what Danielle was pointing out.
mhm,
So so we looked at some examples of books and some examples of movies that are embedded with magical realism or that are good examples of
mhm.
magical realism in practice.
Potter. I
Harry
mean, Percy
Potter,
Jackson. We talked about Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children. We had talked about what other ones have we talked about? A lot of them.
Well, Harry Potter, I think, would probably be the most,
Mhm,
well known. But there are some others that are maybe a little less well known, but they've won a lot of literary awards, and that would be The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman. Neil
mhm,
Gaiman is a very famous and popular author. Like Water for Chocolate by Laura Esquivel.
mhm,
100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And the books that you have written, CJ, uh,
mhm.
would you say most of your books are reflective of magical realism, or do you have some that are better examples than others? I know you write your series, I should say.
Yeah, I think the Sands of Time trilogy and Chain Reaction are probably more a better example of it because the other ones kind of fall more under paranormal, supernatural, but they do appear in the world. So there is a layer of it across all of them, but more so probably the Sands of Time trilogy. Because tell people that's kind of like Stranger Things minus the Mind Flayer stuff meets X-Men, which Stranger Things and X-Men are literally what we're talking about. And then the time travel element, that's your magical portion where they're traveling back in time and it's been created by the inventor, which is the great 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 grandson Trip. And so those are good elements as far as magical realism, if I'm following you correctly.
Oh yeah, yeah. So I the of the books I've written, probably the one that is the best example of magical realism is the Treasure Hunt Club.
Mhm,
And in the Treasure Hunt Club, you have a character that everybody can identify with.
mhm,
You have a real world scenario. The one thing that's different, the magical element that makes it magical realism, is that the main character finds a mystical or magical book that can
mhm,
locate anything down through history that has ever been lost.
mhm,
So there's your magical twist. Okay. And uh, some of the other um, popular books, which we would probably call comic books, Superman, Batman, uh,
Spider-Man.
Aquaman, Wonder Woman, you know, they're all examples of comic books that reflect magical realism as well.
Some shows would be like, Warehouse 13, Doctor Who is huge version of that, but, like, Warehouse 13 happens that's probably the closest one because they find different The Librarians is another one that's really good.
Librarian's a good example. Yeah, that is. Um, some of the ones that we probably don't even think of that are excellent examples of magical realism would be the Indiana Jones movie trilogy,
Yep,
Raiders of the Lost Ark, the
yep,
Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. Another one, a beloved classic, Mary Poppins,
mhm,
magical realism. My daughter's favorite all-time movie, which she's probably seen a dozen times, The Goonies.
mhm,
Okay, magical realism. Uh, One of my favorite movies, and I've probably seen it half a dozen or more times, is Groundhog Day.
mhm.
Okay, Pan's Labyrinth, Big Fish. You mentioned Doctor Who.
Stargate
What's that?
Stargate Stargate series.
Stargate, Doctor Doolittle. Uh,
Mhm,
and one example you mentioned earlier when we talked before the show went on, CJ, Stranger Things,
mhm,
huge series now. And so those are all examples of movies or shows that are associated with magical realism.
mhm,
So it is a lot more, uh, wouldn't you say, CJ, it's a lot more common than the average person or even average author might think. It's
it
used a
is.
lot more than we might think.
It is, but it poses a huge problem for authors because there's so many subgenres and like for
Hmm.
categories calling their books under, it's really hard to figure out, okay, I mean, you've got like the main category of either sci-fi and or fantasy, but it's like breaking down those subcategories, which ones do you stick them in that people can find them? And there's not enough categories out there for a lot of these, and a lot of them like, "Well, just pick the primary." Well, if you pick the primary, you miss the magical realism portion, which a lot of people, like you said, skip over fantasy because they're not into, like, fairies and warlocks and werewolves and vampires and stuff, but they might actually like this stuff. And it's like but they don't see it because there's not enough subgenre categories to do that.
It's if authors or writers are watching, do advertising on Amazon and do Amazon ads, what you mentioned can be a real head scratcher nightmare trying to figure out what categories to market your book under because
Mhm,
there are a lot of subgenres. And two, you flip side of what you're mentioning, CJ, is that while we would like we as authors would like to appeal to a larger audience because obviously if we do our books will be much more successful, by the same token you do have hardcore fantasy and science fiction that expect the magical world and the world building and all that goes with it, and they
mhm.
don't want a fantasy light novel. uh,
Yeah.
they want the whole enchilada, so to speak.
It's balance. It's trying to figure out that hefty balance into it, you know, and being a multi-genre author, it's a little easier for me to play within the different genres. But if somebody's like a hard and fast, I am this type of an author, there's not a lot of wiggle room in those. So you kind of got to sometimes walk a tightrope.
True. And it's difficult at times, but I've said this before, and I'll probably say it many more times. Regardless of how you market your book, regardless of whether you have a strong undercurrent of magical realism or it's straight, straight up fantasy with the hardcore world building, a good
Mhm.
story is where you start and end. If your story's good, uh, the rest is downhill after. But if you've got a good story, uh, you can do a lot with that. And there's a lot of people that we've met them, uh, that think the story comes second place to how you market it or the genres or the categories you put it in. And I have been doing this long enough now. You've been doing it longer than I have, CJ, so you're probably more experienced. But it really does come down to your writing style and your story.
Yeah,
But
because I mean, I do Christian fiction, but like somebody who reads, say, Lana Lynn's, who we're talking to next weekend, might not like mine. And I tell people flat out, it's not your mama's Christian fiction. So a lot of it can just depend on your style. And some people are like, well, I don't like fantasy or I don't like sci-fi, but I like your books because they're different. And so it's like if you can find your niche, whatever it is, it will take off without you. You don't even need to do it. Just you have to write a good story. Whatever the story is, make sure that the story itself is good.
well, I think that's a pretty good 30 minutes of talking about magical realism. And I've learned a little bit having to do some of the research on this. But I will say that your books, CJ, are very reflective of magical realism in the sense that you can pick up the book series that you have mentioned and you can relate immediately to the characters. You can relate
Mhm,
immediately to the story, and it may have a magical element or a time travel, for example. But
mhm.
if you just have to have a little bit of imagination, just a little bit, you know, and you'll
Sometimes a
be
little bit
okay.
more depending upon which series you picked up, but yes.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
Uh,
definitely. So I'm looking forward to next week. We're gonna be talking to Lon and Lynn, as I said, about Christian fiction. But the following 2 weeks, we will be off because we'll be out of town. So we're not gonna have it for the next 2 weeks after that. We will return then we will have next week, but then we're gonna have a break till February 1st. We'll come back at that point. So in the meantime, thank you, Mike, so much for all the work you did for today's presentation. I really appreciate it. And hopefully we didn't confuse you authors any further, but maybe helped enlighten some readers as well. And kind of maybe gave some authors some ideas on how to do their next book or the book their current work in progress. So in the meantime, guys, we'll see you next week, same time, same place you found us. We'll see you then.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye bye.